Welcome to the Deep Blue on My Doorstep podcast. I'm Tracy Ainsworth from the University of New South Wales. In this podcast series, we will talk to marine experts about the marine environments that we have right on our doorsteps and what we can do to help conserve and protect these blue spaces. Today, we're talking to John Turnbull. He's a researcher at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and he's doing some really interesting work that many people out there might not be aware goes on. So, hi, John, and welcome today, and thanks so much for joining us to talk about your work.
Hi, Tracy. It's great to be here.
John, your research looks at nature and marine spaces, but what you really work on is the relationship that people have with nature and natural places. So I was wondering, can you explain to us, what does that mean? What is that research into the relationship between people and place? And how do people understand that they play a role, not just in how they interact with the marine environments that they may love, but in what happens in the future and also the research that's going on?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is, until you sit down to think about it, we tend to think about our own world and, the train we're catching and the place we're going to the movies. But in fact, we are integral with nature. Humans and nature are really part of one big system. We can't live without planet Earth, and we're a big part of what happens on planet Earth these days with the effects of human activities. So the relationship between people and place being either a local place or all the way up to the planet, is a very strong one and a very important one, and one that we can't ignore. We don't live in a vacuum. And so I think, to me, an interesting thing, the most interesting thing that I've been pursuing is, often with research, it tends to be, let's study a forest, but we don't want people in there. We're going to study the trees only. Or let's study people and their attitudes, but let's not try to connect it with nature. To me, it's actually the connection that's the important bit and the interesting bit. So as a researcher, I think the sort of work that I do tries to not look at one or the other of those two pieces, people and place, as a separate thing, but actually the connection. And as I've explored this, and both in my own life and in the interviews that I do with people, it's clear that connection is so central to really everybody. Everyone has a place they love. Everyone has a deep connection, particularly in Australia, where 85% of our population lives within 50 k's of the coast, and as part of what we call the Australian lifestyle.
Yeah.
And so, to me, it's really where the action is in terms of understanding things.
Yeah.
But it's also where the action is for conservation, because when it comes down to it, conservation is about humans and human behaviour and trying to understand and modify those. If nature was just left to its own devices, it would figure itself out. So it's the human side of the relationship that actually is the focal point for conservation.
I think that's fantastic, because then it really talks to people about, like you said, that we all live close to the coastline and we have these places we're so connected to. And I love that people can start to see that they are part of what happens into the future. When I was reading about your career and your research, I came across the term stakeholder relationships or stakeholder relations. And I really love that, because for people listening out there to see and to understand that their interaction with the places they love and those marine environments means they actually have a stake in the future. They hold a stake in what is happening now and what's going to happen for their kids. And I think that what's really great about your research is that bringing together of people and place and recognising how humans' role in what happens next is really important. One thing I was really interested in is that you said that you can use this kind of information for better conservation outcomes. So how can people, for example, translate their love of their place, and whether it's through fishing or through surfing or beach walking? I mean, like you said, 85% of the people live close to the coast and they probably interact with it multiple times in the day. So how does that interaction result in good conservation outcomes?
Well, I think it does, as you say, it does pin itself really onto this idea of stakeholders, because a stakeholder relationship is a two-way thing. So, if you said to a person that surfed, look, we're going to put a marina where your surf spot is, they would clearly feel that that's something that they should have a say in. But also the actions of those people that are surfing affect that place. So it affects them and they affect it. And so as a stakeholder, I think the key thing is to understand that two-way relationship. It's not just take, it's also give. And a lot of people who have the deepest relationships with a place understand that, and they want to look after it, they want to take care of it, and that's where conservation kicks in. So studying stakeholders and those relationships gives you these little gems of, well, let's work on the common values and the shared values. And I think that's then the key to conservation. Because if we can find, instead of saying we're going to try and ban something or stop something, if we can work instead on the positive and say, well, let's actually find out what people value and say, well, we need to take these actions so that the thing you value will still be there for your kids. That's a much more positive form of conservation. So a lot of my research is really about that, saying, well, let's focus on the positive things we can do rather than try to, overcome conflicts and focus on conflicts. Yeah. And so that term, the positive things we can do, is called, we're calling stewardship. And so it's this idea of caring for something. And so I've done quite a lot of work on, what is stewardship, what are the actions that people take, the sort of the work we do identifies there are a series of steps or actions that people take when they take care of a place. So just understanding that and unpacking stewardship and the motivations for it, to me, is a really interesting way of driving conservation.
Yeah. Do you find that when you're talking to people that they don't recognise that their different uses actually have common values?
Yeah, look, I think we live in a world where the media and so on thrives on conflict, and, it's a big story. We don't hear as many good news stories as we hear of conflict stories. It's just the way that communication seems to work, particularly around the environment. And I think that's sad, because there are so many shared values. And certainly amongst often there's conflict painted between stakeholders. But when it comes down to it, we all want to think that marine life is healthy, it's abundant, it's living in a healthy environment. If we're entering the environment, we like to think it's pollution-free, it's aesthetically pleasing. I think most people agree on, smoke spewing out of a smokestack is not aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah.
And, a beautiful beach with sand is. So to me, there are all these areas of commonality which I think aren't recognised, to be honest, and are absolutely, as you say, yeah.
So you come from a background growing up in quite an urbanised coastal environment. So you grew up in Sydney. It's really interesting to think about a scientist coming into and looking at nature and wild spaces from that prism of growing up in an urbanised environment. So growing up, how did you take that step from, growing up as a Sydney local to, this love of marine spaces and founding Marine Explorer, all these wonderful things that you do?
Yeah, well, I didn't live on the coast. I lived in the western suburbs. And so to me, going to the beach was a special treat.
Yeah.
And I think that might be where it came from. I think it can work both ways. If you live right on the coast, then clearly it's part of your DNA.
Yeah.
But if you visit enough for it to be a wow moment as a kid, then that's what it was for me. And it was the rock platforms actually that were the trigger, because, as I don't know, it must have been 5 or 6 or 8 or something.
Yeah.
running around in bare feet, cutting your feet on oysters, finding octopus,
Yeah.
finding sea stars, which you've never before seen in your life. These alien creatures. That was the trigger for me, and I can still replay in my mind, particularly down at Cronulla,
Yeah.
platforms just south of Cronulla. I think one of them's Oak Park around there. Anyway, I can still replay that
Yeah.
in my mind, those rock pools. And so I think it's more than pragmatic. There's something emotional in it. There's childhood memories, there's passion, there's a sense of
Yeah.
discovery, and that drives feelings within you that don't necessarily connect to the pragmatic side of, say, a job
Yeah.
or science. But probably most people that are motivated in their careers are motivated by deep passions that they probably
Yeah.
don't put into words, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's probably the case for me.
So for you, is a sense of adventure and discovery of something new? Is that what started your role in science?
I think so. I think it's the alien nature of it to kids,
Yeah.
in an urban backyard with fruit trees that you go to this other place, and it's like the moon or it's like Mars. And
Yeah.
eight armed creatures that have suckers on them, and
Climbing out of the deep.
we sort of when we try to portray aliens, they tend to look a lot like octopus, right? Let's face it.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? In science fiction, there's so many things coming out of the ocean trying to, massive in size, trying to eat people, that engage young boys and young kids in their imaginations of what is possibly out there.
That's right. And I suppose also another thing which is probably in my case maybe not everyone has this, but I went down a pragmatic path. So when I finished school, what sort of work am I going to do?
Yeah.
And I got a lot of advice from family and friends and whatever, and they said, you like pulling things apart, so why don't you become an engineer because you like understanding how things work.
Yeah.
So I went down that path. So for a couple of
Wow.
decades, actually, I went down the path of business and consulting, and then just one day I just realised I'm not motivated by this anymore. I've never lost that passion for the ocean, and so I, swapped the business suit for a wetsuit. And
Nice. Do you think though that time you spent in business and consulting though kind of fed your passion for linking people and marine spaces? Is that where that came from?
yeah, it did actually. So even though I went into engineering and I got involved in projects, I then got involved in business consulting, and it became clear to me that business consulting is all about human behaviour and stakeholders, right? So you've got employees and customers and partners and the government. So I moved into that space, and the consulting business that I started and ran for 14 years was stakeholder engagement. So I was helping companies to engage with their stakeholders. And then when I said, no, it's time now for me to actually pursue my true passion, which is marine, I thought, well, what are the stakeholders of the marine environment and how well do we understand them? And in a way, you could think about, who are the customers of, say, a coastal park or a marine protected area?
Yeah.
Well, they're the stakeholders, right? And so do we understand what drives them and how they use these places and how to build stronger relationships between, say, the local council and the stakeholders of a beach area. And so that sort of guided my move into that space. And so what's become clear to me is this is a relatively new and blossoming area of scientific research, which is social ecological systems, thinking about the human nature relationship as a system, each one dependent on the other, and how does that system work and how do we help it to work better.
Yeah, that's lovely that people have that role in what's happening around them. And even your story that you've come from a business background with that love and moved into kind of connecting almost business and nature through what you do. But for those people out there who maybe aren't ready to or don't want to make that huge leap, how do they then become involved as stakeholders and have an influence on what happens? Like, how do they talk to you or other people like you?
Well, there are probably a couple of things in there. One is, as part of the research that we've done, we've looked at the characteristics of high stewardship people and why they do it and what motivates them. And so it's really interesting. One is that they just get in the water. So immersing yourself in your place, I think, is a really big step. And you might think, well, of course I do that, but actually, there are less and less people who are spending time in nature now. We're becoming increasingly urbanised, and we're living our lives much more through our phones and our laptops. So I think if you've got a Sunday or something, saying, no, I'm actually going to go out there and immerse myself in the place, because you don't get smells or other sensory inputs through a laptop, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the first thing is make sure you reserve time to immerse yourself in place. I think the second thing is embrace the social network at your place, because this is a strong indicator of stewardship, is people that had large social networks at that place tended to be much better stewards. So, join a club or, engage more with people that are sitting nearby and actually build a stronger social network of like-minded people that care or experience that place was the second thing.
Yeah.
And then a final thing was just to share your experiences with others, not communicate. And these days we are very lucky to have social media, which, of course, we didn't have when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And put up photos and promote and say, hey, I was here at this place today and I saw this amazing bird, or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Share that and so help others to think, well, actually, I might go there too, because it's through experiencing these places that we deepen our connection. And then the stewardship just happens naturally. If you go to a place often enough and you appreciate it and you value it, well, you'll pick up that bit of rubbish. Whereas if you see yourself as temporary and just going by, you might walk past it.
That's a really fantastic set of tips, and I really like the idea that by being part of place and seeing yourself as a part of that place, that you become a steward and a positive interaction, and also using social media, because like you say, there's lots of negatives that we have around social media, but using it in a positive way to engage others and expand our networks into place, embed those social networks deeply in the place that we are, enhances stewardship and things like picking up rubbish and what a positive change that can be, those simple acts.
Yeah, well, and that actually is why I started Marine Explorer. So, and that was actually before I did the research. So it was just something I felt, which was there's so much negativity out there and there's so much, bad news. I'm just going to once a day, I'm just going to put one of my photos online. I'm going to write a little bit about, hey, this is a cuttlefish, change colour or whatever. I'll put one photo and a little paragraph or a sentence or two every single day. It's a positive thing and it's sharing something that I care about. And that's all I did. I just started doing that. And then it grew from there. And I said, well, I probably should have a website now. So I built the website. I've been doing it on Facebook. I probably should do it on Twitter. So it just sort of grew over time. And now it's, I'm still doing it. Crikey, how many years later now? I think it's about 8 years.
And you're talking about marineexplorer.org?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was about 8 years ago that I started that and said, I'm going to do this every day. It's, 5 minutes a day. But, I looked the other day and there's something like 5 million views of a photo library. And
wow.
There's a lot. I think it's about 1,700 a day.
That's fantastic.
So, and look, they're just ordinary photos. But the point is, it sort of tells me that there is a bit of a vacuum there, and that actually it is rewarding and it is constructive to share your passion with the wider world through social media in a positive way. which for me was a bit of an experiment because I thought, I'm just going to do it and see what happens.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that there's that audience for it and that hunger for the information about what is that thing that I saw washed up on the beach? Where has it come from? What's its role? How does that ecosystem that's outside our doors, it's right there in front of us, hidden under the ocean, how does it work? And there's that sense of mystery and adventure that, like you're saying, captured us as children. It's still there.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's amazing to see how much desire there is for some of that content.
Yeah.
And it's also the other thing which is interesting is because you're very close to something, you love it and whatever, you don't realize just what might be interesting to other people.
Yeah.
So I think it is that idea of sharing your passion and taking the time to do positive communication definitely is worth doing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's the only way to take people along, isn't it? If they feel that it's a positive and valuable thing to do and that there's hope that it's going to result in something positive. One of the other things I've been reading about in your work was you've written a bit about rewilding and rewilding Australia, which I think is really interesting because if you talk to most people, I think the assumption is that Australia is quite a wild place, it's still a bit of a frontier and we've still got all these amazing wild areas. But in terms of rewilding the ocean, if talking to general public and to most people out there, why are we talking about rewilding the ocean?
Well, I think there's a concept called shifting baselines, which was the work of other scientists, where they realised that every generation is when a generation is born, their starting point is what they see as good. And the trouble is, in a system that's declining over multiple generations, we lose sight of what good used to be.
Yeah.
So when I went fishing with my dad, I'd catch maybe a flathead or two in a day, and that was good to me.
Yeah.
Well, if you go back to when, say, Captain Cook arrived, one or two fish resulting from a whole day fishing was not really. They would have expected a lot more than that. And in fact, you look at the photos, they caught hundreds of fish a day. And if you go back to Indigenous people, even further back, they would catch 200, 300 kilogram stingrays in Botany Bay.
Yeah.
So a really important part of rewilding is to sort of think about, well, what is wild? And it's not the world that we live in now. So if you look at research, recent research that looked at, say, fish biomass in Australia, it declined by 30% over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So even in one decade, what we see today is, hey, this is a nice spot, it's got lots of fish, is actually probably 30% depleted on 10 years ago. So I think not accepting an impoverished system is a key part of rewilding. And it's, resetting our expectations. Well, we should be able to go for a swim and actually see big schools of big fish with lots of diversity. That's a rewilded system. So rewilding on land is a different challenge altogether, because on land you can put up fences and you can reintroduce animals to an area and protect them. And so if you want to bring Tasmanian devils back to the mainland, which 500 years ago we had Tasmanian devils on the mainland, you can do so, right? You can choose an area and you can fence it off and so on. Whereas in the ocean, you can't really do that. It's not the same proposition. And so rewilding in the ocean is pretty much about protected areas saying, well, we can't remove all human pressures from an area. We can't stop warming, for example, but we can remove as many as possible. So we can remove anchoring damage and fishing pressure and as much as possible pollution, people dropping things, and making the area more natural often is enough.
Yeah. So just how we interact, even just subtle changes, can help to make a system become more wild. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, there's two forms of rewilding. There's active rewilding, where you actively introduce something or intervene, and then there's passive rewilding, which is let's remove the human influences and let the system come back. And I think in the ocean, it's much more about that. I mean, we can, release young fish into estuaries and so on, but that's not really rewilding. That's often about improving fishing.
Yeah.
So to me, rewild is about bringing back diversity and abundance, and that really means removing as many human pressures as possible from as large an area as possible. And you look at the research there, and we're really talking about 30% of the system. So we put aside 30% of each type of habitat and so on in the marine system, remove those pressures and let those systems come back if we're serious about rewilding the ocean.
Yeah. And that's interesting when you put that in the context of, for example, in just 10 years, you can see a big change. And that is when you put that in the context of, for example, children being inspired by what's possible, is that you can see in one childhood, a system could actually come back to something that we recognise as more wild.
And that is the experience of people. So if you look at, say, Shelley Beach here in Sydney, when they protected that, and they also cleaned up the pollution at the same time. So it's not just protection, it's also about removing other forms of impact. People will tell you within a few years the fish came back and the kelp started coming back, and the shells, all of a sudden they would see shells that they didn't see before. So you do see it in a matter of a few years. You need to live in place for decades to get a really big impact, but you start to notice things within a few years.
That's fantastic when we can talk about that different trajectory, one of an upwards one where people can experience things coming back that they may have experienced with their grandfather when they were kids, and then they can now experience it with their children, actually see it coming back. So it's great. There's these powerful examples of, even in really urbanised places like Sydney, you can actually see positive change coming back. So what do you think the future holds then for us? So what does it look like for you, seeing the world through that prism of people and their connection to place?
I think people that have been following this closely, for example, with climate change, have known for a long time that we need to change what we're doing and changing our exploitative attitude towards nature. It's not just about take, it's also about give. But the trouble is that hasn't been a widespread view. For example, businesses that extract or mine or whatever, that's what they're there for. That's what their shareholders expect them to do. So I think as a society, we're starting to realise that it's not about one company or one person's rights. It's about the whole system being healthy. So to me, the future is much more a bigger picture or a systematic view of these things. So not looking at whether or not one group or one small area or one company can do X or Y, but how do we make the whole system work better? And I think there are a few parts to that. One is recognising that we are stewards of the planet now, whether we like it or not. Yeah. When there were only 1,000 or 100,000 humans living on the planet, we weren't having much impact, and so we could do what we liked. Now that there are billions, we're now in a position where what we choose to do actually affects the very system on which we depend. And so we're starting to realise that now, I think. And you look at the shift in thinking around climate change, you're starting to realise, no, actually, we are creating this problem, even though people have denied it for a long time.
Well, it's a powerful example, isn't it, that humans collectively can change the world. We've done it.
Well, we can do it, and so it's both ways, right? We collectively have pushed it to a warming state. We could also collectively bring it back, but we have to take that big picture view, that sort of planetary stewardship view, and say we are actually now in a position where our actions will make or break this system, because there are so many of us now and the impacts we have are so vast, and our technology, our cars and our industries are much more impactful than when we lived in caves. And I'm not suggesting we go back to that. I'm just saying we need to manage the system in recognition of the impact we have. So I do think in terms of the future, we're starting to realise that. I just hope that we don't leave it too long, because eventually we will have to live in harmony with the planet. That is a given. It's a finite system, and eventually it will reach an equilibrium. The question is, how much pain is there along the way? And the sooner we start to reduce our impacts and start to take care of our life support system, the less people and species will suffer from what we're doing.
And the more we as humans will have available then for that balance. If we tip it too far one direction, it's a lot more work to try and bring it back. Do you see, when you talk to people in your research, because a lot of your research is working with people who are in place, do you see that hunger for change?
It was interesting. We asked a few questions in the recent round of research around Southern Australia, and we asked people, how good is this area compared to others nearby? Is it better than other areas or worse? And people tended to overestimate how good their area was, because that was their emotion coming through. And then we asked them whether they'd seen changes over time, and that was largely negative. People say, yes, it's been going downhill. And then we asked them about 5 years in the future, and people were much more positive. So you can almost say that their optimism is not founded in reality, right? Because we're on a downward trend, less fish, more rubbish, whatever, but they think it's going to turn around. But I do think that's something that we can tap into. People have this desire and this optimism for the future, and we just have to enable them. We just have to say, well, we can get to that improved state, and here are the things that need to happen.
That's fantastic. I love that idea that we can enable them. And what you were saying earlier about people even just recognising and taking pride in their interaction with those places. Get into nature, get into the marine environment, be proud of loving it, and the role you play, the stake you have in the future can actually feed into and tap into that positive change and changing trajectories that we have for these marine places.
Yeah, and it's part of who we are. So many people talked about their place as being part of them, or and they would use those words. It's who I am. I am a person that lives in this place, and so it's part of our identity. And we see ourselves as beach-loving people, or surfing nation, or a coastal nation. Well, okay, if that's the case, we better take care of ourselves and get a health check more regularly and look after our sense of identity beyond our own physical bodies, and actually look after the environment that is also part of our identity. And, I mentioned that health check. It is one other thing, and that is unless you're monitoring the condition of something, you really don't know whether it's going down. And that is something that we've found is people, as I said before, in terms of shifting baselines, they lose sight of what good is. But countering that, we did also find that people could quite accurately estimate how good a place was in terms of, say, fish abundance and so on compared to other places.
Oh, fantastic!
So if we sort of dug into what's good about this place, often the things that they would say were actually held up by the scientific reality of what we were also, because we did underwater surveys as well.
Yeah.
And so I do think that monitoring the condition of our places is a really important thing that we're maybe not doing well enough, and then publicising it. And I think this is a role that science has, a really important role, is more, whether it's funding or volunteer or whatever, but more monitoring actions so we can plot trajectories of places and actually see for ourselves, well, actually the biomass has gone down the last 3 years in our local spot. Let's do something about that.
That's fantastic, because then people have a role through what they're doing, don't they? They're records of what they catch and where they catch it, how they caught it, how much of it they caught, what they saw actually becomes part of that long record of what's available and the health of the system. Because I mean, that's what you were talking about with the records of what Indigenous people were able to catch and what first settlers were able to catch, and then it all becomes part of this big story of our coastline.
That's right, and that's really where citizen science comes in. So it's been growing over the years, and it's more and more interesting now because you've got online platforms where you post your photos, and so to me, coming back to one of your other questions, one thing that people can do is look for ways of recording what's happening in their place. Look for a local citizen science program. Doesn't even have to be a local one. You name it, there's a citizen science program for it.
Fantastic.
Birds, frogs, fish. There are so many. So, one thing that anyone can do is go online, find a citizen science program, sign up for it, and actually start taking photos and recording things. And then that feeds into, if you look at Reef Life Survey, which is a program I've been involved in now for a while, that feeds into scientific research, which is then published in prestigious papers, which is then used to make decisions about, protected areas or whatever.
I think that's a great point, that it influences the decisions. So they're actually part of people are part of the records that are being made, and then those records are being used to make decisions that will influence how they actually do interact with their places. So they really are stakeholders all the way through to policy that is made in government.
Yeah, and it's once again, it's a two-way thing, right? So you take photographs or you do surveys, whatever it may be, and that's your contribution. But in return, you learn so much. And one way of thinking that it's the difference between putting a mask and a snorkel on, looking and seeing 100 silver fish, and instead seeing 100 fish of 3 different species of different sizes, doing different behavioural things. The richness that you see when you just get involved in citizen science, you have a new set of lenses on. You see so much more in a given scene because you've learned to ID things, and you've learned that, hey, that's a predator and that's a herbivore. And so when you look at a scene, you get so much more out of it. So that's the bit you get back.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Thanks so much. I've learned so much from chatting to you today. If you had to pick one place that you find you have that deep connection, that you maybe has really influenced your work and your life, where would that be?
I think so. It's definitely coastal Sydney. Is the place I feel closest to. But then, to be honest, all of Australia's coastline sort of feels like
home
on my place. So if I go to Ningaloo, if I go to Rottnest Island or whatever, I sort of feel like I belong.
Yeah, that's lovely.
So to me, the place where the sea meets the land and a little bit underwater to, where the aliens live, the cuttlefish and the nudibranchs and that sort of strip all the way around Australia, I feel like is my close place. And I'd say that probably, even though I started in the intertidal and I love the rock platforms, my passion has moved a little bit more to being immersed in the underwater world these days. I still love to go for a walk on a rock platform, but there's something really amazing about you put the regulator in your mouth, you submerge, and all of a sudden you're weightless. It's quiet except for the sounds of nature. All you hear are the fish, and if you're lucky, maybe whale in the distance or something like that. But all you hear are the living things around you. There's no traffic, there's no radios, there's no music. And you just have this total immersion in a new world. And I think, to me, that's my sort of happy place away from my suburban home where my family are. that's the sort of natural place that I retreat to.
That's absolutely beautiful. So you still are that little kid chasing that sense of adventure then?
Yeah, well, look, people say that. I think maybe for me, I've probably never grown up. Maybe I'll never grow old. I don't know.
I don't want to grow up either.
Yeah, well, look, I think it's the sense of wonder and discovery that I seek out.
Yeah.
And you have that moment where you see a species you've never seen before, and you get a photograph of it, or you go a little bit up or down the coast, and you see a kelp forest that you've never been in before, and you can dig around and explore in amongst the fronds. And to me, that's
fantastic, because after a life of interacting with these places and recording them scientifically and studying them, you still are finding new things.
Well, the world's a big place, and the research that I've just done covers 7,000 kilometres of coastline, and I probably only saw half of 1% of it. In my lifetime, I'll never get beyond even scratching the surface of this underwater world.
But there is still just so much on our doorstep for people to discover.
There is, and even if you go back to the same place over and over again, you'll see a behaviour you hadn't seen before, or a migrating bird will come in that you haven't seen. Nature never stands still, and if we look after it and we have biodiversity and abundance, there's plenty to see.
That's awesome. Thanks, John. That was just lovely. I got a tear in my eye, actually. John Turnbull, thank you so very much for coming and chatting to us today. It's been really wonderful to talk to you. And for anyone that's interested in what you're doing, marineexplorer.org. Anything else you can recommend that they jump online and have a look at?
Oh, look, I certainly think join a local snorkel club or dive club, or just get out there and in the water is a key thing. So I'm a member of a dive club underwater research group, which is in Sydney, but wherever you go, there'll be places like that. There'll be clubs like that. Try to find one that's really about experiencing the natural world rather than just the activity side. I think finding like-minded people who just like to hang around and look at fish rather than try to, go too far or whatever. I think if find a group that suits you is really important. And we mentioned citizen science. Look for a citizen science program. And final thing is just, as we said, share. Tell everyone. Tell people about your passion, and they'll become passionate too.
That's fantastic spot to end on. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've learned so much today.
Thanks, Trace.
Thank you for listening to the Deep Blue On My Doorstep podcast. Don't forget to check out our website at events.unsw.edu.au, where you'll find all the photographs from this podcast series featuring the beautiful places that we've been discussing and the organisms found in these blue spaces.